At this point in time, we'll go into the Q&A session. We have about 17 minutes for this, or maybe longer. So we hope that most of the questions that you have will be answered by these experts. So Mr. Robert Kasande, now that I'm sure you can hear me, here's a question for you. One of the attendees asked that in regards to oil and environmental pollution, especially in South Sudan, what are the ways that Uganda can prepare or is already prepared to stop such environmental pollution from the fossil fuel industry, particularly in regards to protecting the local communities from these impacts and compensating them? Are there frameworks in place against oil companies? This is a question I also hope Dr. Kosheshe will add his remarks on it. So Mr. Robert Kasande.
I think luckily for us in Uganda, we came in to start our developments, our exploration, when global environmental legislation had taken root. Particularly here in Uganda, we already had the National Environment Management Act. And so it was very easy for us to fall in line in regards to whatever we were doing. Every project, whether it's a seismic survey, whether it's a well being drilled, is required to undertake an environmental impact and social assessment. But we have also been very aware that nearly all our resources coincide with biodiversity conservation. And therefore, it is incumbent on us to ensure that if we are going to coexist with conservation, we must do it right. So we have had to undertake frameworks like strategic environment assessment for the entire Albert and Graben, where the oil resources are. We require environmental impact and social assessment. We have undertaken sensitivity analysis in these areas to ensure that where it's very sensitive, mitigations are heightened. So we have not seen challenges, and we don't envisage any going forward, irrespective of the environment where we are hosted. Because in this world today, you cannot pollute here in Uganda and you think you are safe. Clearly a global world when it comes to this operation.
Thank you, Mr. Robert Kasande. Dr. Kosheshe, would you have some insights onto that as well?
Yes, Joe, I didn't pick your question clearly, but from the responses given by the PS, which I listened in, looks like it was more to do with what as a country, Uganda, are we doing to mitigate the impacts of oil activities on the environment? Was it along those lines?
Yes, it was along those lines and looking at the policy framework.
I think the permanent secretary has stated the key measures that as government of Uganda has put in place, and which are really aligned around 3 areas. That is making sure that we have very strong institutions that can regulate and monitor these oil and gas activities. So that's one area as a government we have emphasized on, to make sure that the relevant regulatory institutions are strong and are facilitated to be able to carry on their mandate. The other aspect, again, putting in place the necessary policy, legal, and regulatory framework, where the PS mentioned, for example, the strategic environment assessment that was undertaken to guide the policy, plans, and programs that relate to the oil and gas sector, but also a number of relevant laws that have been put in place. And most of the other laws to do with the environment have actually been reviewed in the wake of the oil and gas sector. So yes, broadly around institutional development, the legal and regulatory framework, and then making sure that we have an efficient and effective supervisory and enforcement strategy.
Thank you very much thank you, Dr. Kosheshe. We appreciate those answers from you and our permanent secretary, Mr. Robert Kasande. We will have our next question, and this is addressed to Professor Damilola. And one of the participants is asking, what are your thoughts on the potential for collaboration among African countries to explore and exploit their extractive resources together and to share knowledge and technologies. So it is, what are your thoughts on the potential for collaboration among African countries to explore and exploit their extractive resources together and to share knowledge and technologies? Professor Damilola, if you could answer one of the attendees. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good question. And what I think the move to, or the transition away from an hydrocarbon-based economy to a cleaner economy will require a lot of partnerships at all levels, really, at the governmental level, at the university level, at all levels that you can think of. For example, in the EU, there is the Renewable Knowledge Platform that has been created, which allows EU countries to monitor best practices and policies and share knowledge amongst themselves. Even in the Middle East, there is the Renewable Energy Knowledge Platform as well. And I think African countries should begin to think of that, creating a knowledge platform that would allow all governments across the continent to share best practices, because some African countries are making more progress than the other. For example, Morocco is doing very well when it comes to low carbon transition. So we can learn from them. We can have that platform that would allow us to share knowledge. Also, when we think of, someone asked about how to reduce the dependence on oil and gas and the rest. I think we all know in many African countries, everyone wants to work with the Petroleum Authority of Uganda or with NNPC in Nigeria. But I think if governments can make other sectors equally as attractive, then people will begin to, for example, I've been saying there should be a renewable energy authority in many countries as well, which will begin to sensitize people on the importance of other aspects of the extractive or the renewable energy industry, and make it. So I think finally, in terms of universities, this event is a good starting point in which you have the extractives of in the UK collaborating with other research entities in Uganda, in Nigeria, and the likes. I think we need to encourage more of this, such that we can transfer best practices and learn new knowledge and unlearn ideas that may not move us forward.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was very precise, and I believe the attendant that asked the question is more than satisfied with your answer. We have another question. Actually, two of them are addressed to Ms. Kate, but if I may pick one of them. Ms. Kate, someone asked, African countries seem to have been slow in adopting renewable energy. How do you believe the current pandemic can contribute to speed up implementation of renewable energy projects in the future? If it can, and it has another part, and it says, if it can contribute to the speed at all. So it's African countries seem to have been slow in adopting renewable energy. How do you believe the current pandemic can contribute to speed up implementation of renewable projects in the future? And if you also can combine this question with the second one, someone else asked, what advice do you have for governments and manufacturers in making renewable energy more affordable to every citizen?
Right. Thank you for that. Let's see if I can combine those two into one answer. And please let me know in case I don't answer any aspect of that question. Well, I have mixed feelings with that statement that Africa has been slow in adopting, I think, or putting into effect renewable energy. I would say not really slow, but as we saw with our first speaker, and I think also Dr. Kobusheshe, you've alluded to this, is that still Africa is largely reliant, and many African countries are largely reliant on fossil fuel energy. This is not to say, again, that there's no development in terms of renewable energy, but largely reliant on still fossil fuel energy. In terms of how is it that the pandemic can speed it up, like I said in my presentation, the idea is that, or rather the presumption now is that with the low prices or the lack of demand because of closure of infrastructure and the like, that now focus shifts away from fossil fuel energy and more into renewable energy as a sort of sustainable, and again, I put this bold, underlined in red, italicized, reliable source of energy. And by reliable, I mean that can get to every citizen, every corner of the country, and uninterrupted is basically what I mean. In terms of how the pandemic can speed it up, maybe, and this is off the cuff, it brings into light the need for, and I'll just piggyback off what Prof. Damilola said, the need for partnerships and information exchange in terms of the development and the capacity building to really absorb a lot of these opportunities for renewable energy. The issue is not, is it slow in adopting renewable energy, is there like I said, there's progressive realization. Maybe that time I used it earlier. There's a progressive realization to adopt and to transition into renewable energy. But the question is that, is there a dedicated effort in terms of investment back into the economy, back into development of infrastructure, back into research and innovation? Is there that steady and dedicated investment by the state back into these sectors? And then that can then speed up or increase the pace in which this progressive realization of a transition from fossil fuels into renewables, I think, can be achieved. I forget the second question, but let me know if my answer incorporates the second question.
Yes, the second question was what advice you have for the government and manufacturers in making renewable energy more affordable to every citizen?
Honestly, I'll just again piggyback on what Prof said, partnership, and reinvestment back into the economy, and reinvestment back into research and innovation and development, and also policy, because with increased research, with increased information, then you have increased policy and regulation, not necessarily to limit a lot of these advancements, but rather to advocate and to make available a lot of these advancements to every single citizen in every single corner of every single African country.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kate. We appreciate those answers, and I hope our attendees are satisfied with those remarks because you clearly answered all of them. The third question we have, meant for the third speaker, is for Mr. Stephen Dow, and someone asked, in light of the energy transition, is gas financing cheaper than oil financing, and is renewable energy financing cheaper than oil and gas financing? So they want to know if gas financing is cheaper than oil, and if renewable energy financing is then cheaper than oil and gas.
The actual whether it's cheaper or not completely depends on the individual project and the individual project risks. There's not going to be a general answer for that. But what you can say in very general terms is that the more secure a project is, i.e., you know what the revenues are going to be going forward, and you know what the demand is going to be going forward, and then it's locked in, then the cheaper the financing is going to be, because it becomes a pure financial transaction rather than the bank actually being, or the hedge fund or whatever, being exposed to volumes and price risks. There isn't really a better answer than that. I'm sorry, that's a pretty crappy answer. But generally, it's going to be dependent on the project, and it's going to be dependent on making sure that there is demand for that particular project's output. Sorry.
Okay, that's quite precise, and I think really depends on the project as well. So if we'll have another question regarding to financing of energy ventures, then we'll have it later on. But we'll have the last question, and this goes to Dr. Joseph Kobusheshe. And someone is asking, what insights can you give on what Nigeria can do or is doing to reduce gas flaring that is about 800 million cubic feet per day?
Okay. Someone is asking me about the Nigerian oil and gas industry.
I believe as a health and safety expert, maybe.
Yes, but I think a number of measures to do with that. One is ensuring appropriate designs in place. So I know that most of these facilities in Nigeria have been in place for a long time, since the 60s, probably when the environment movement and the pressure regarding climate change issues was not as strong as it is today. So that would have influenced some of these not being taken into consideration. But I think going forward for all new projects, the first primary defense line or measure that can be put in place to address this is adopting the appropriate designs that limit flaring and only acceptance under emergency or very extraordinary conditions. So like in the Ugandan case, that is what it is. This is actually a requirement in the law that flaring and venting during normal operations is not permitted. It is prohibited by law. So it can be addressed through appropriate policy and legislation. And then from the operator side, of course, ensuring the appropriate designs that are put in place take this into consideration.
Thank you. And if I may ask Professor Damilola, maybe he has something to add on being more in touch with the Nigerian oil and gas sector.
Yes, very well. I think what the Nigerian government is doing, which is very commendable in this area, is to begin to encourage the commercialization of gas that could have been flared. So over the last few years, there was a regulation released which sort of tries to create incentives for companies to now commercialize. If you can, instead of flaring, if you can commercialize, then the government would sort of give you incentives to make it possible. And I think the government decided to adopt this incentive-based approach because over the years, the command and control approach has not worked. We have the Nigerian gas flaring law, which had set an original target of 1982. As when gas flaring would stop, and so it never worked. And many years down the line, many of these command and control type instruments did not work. So I think the current government, in their wisdom, decided to adopt a market-based, incentive-based approach. And so far, we think some progress has been made, by encouraging companies to, maybe reducing tax and reducing, creating generally incentives that would encourage commercialization. I think that's one strategy to end this monstrosity called gas flaring. I agree as well that it's a significant health concern, and what we have been advocating is that there is a need to tighten regulation in terms of ensuring that companies that do not when you, I believe in the carrot and stick approach. When you've thrown the carrot, which is the incentive, then you then tighten regulation as well to say if you don't comply and you don't take advantage of the incentive, then you might lose your license and other things. Also, when we approve the EIAs and the likes, I've advocated personally in my writing that we need to ensure that the current guideline, which is the EGASPIN, which is not a law really, it's a guideline, it's an industry guideline by the DPR. I've encouraged that perhaps if we have a law on this area, it might help action more than relying on the DPR, which issues the licenses to chase after enforcement. So I think those are some of the sticks that we can accentuate as we use the carrots as well. Thank you. Thank
you very much, Professor. And just for the fact that we have some bit of time on us, we could take some questions. We have a question addressed to any of the panelists, but I would believe this time around Mr. Stephen Dow can address this. Ivan Mugavi asks, how can we increase the financial certainty of the intended net present value of sustainable energy projects across the African continent?
I'm not an economist. I have no idea.
So
Net present value is not my goal.
Okay, there's still one more on financing. Permit me to keep sending all of them to you until you get the one you can answer.
Right.
Oluwadare Joshua Oyebode asked, what is your advice and projection for the next 20 years regarding oil pricing and energy financing?
I don't know about oil pricing. If I knew what the oil price would be, I would take a bet in an oil market and go and buy myself a Caribbean island off the result. But broadly speaking, if you look at, what's the pressure to put oil prices up? What's the pressures of putting oil prices down? Right now, there are more pressures going down than there are going up. And until things change fundamentally, that means that you will have low oil prices. And low oil prices will make financing oil projects difficult. Now, don't get me wrong, there will always be the mega projects and the super projects, which are just amazingly good projects, and which will always happen. It's the more difficult projects which you build because you want the oil, or because you want the work, or because or for whatever voluntary reason. It's those ones which are going to get affected. So broadly speaking, I think the pressures on oil prices are always down at the moment. So it's oil financing will become more difficult, and I suspect the pressure on gas pricing, local gas, there's going to be huge downward pressure, but international gas projects, for export, I think those projects are more likely to go ahead. I think it will become easier going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Robert Kasande has an answer as well.
I just wanted to supplement what Professor Doe has said. That financing projects, whether it is oil and gas, whether it is renewables, is project dependent on how attractive a project is, how commercially viable it is. Look at the LPG projects, the gas projects in Mozambique, attracting a whopping $120 billion. These are projects that we have not, these are expenses that we haven't seen in any project. Maybe projects going to the moon have kind of spent this kind of money. So if the project is mature and is commercially viable, whether it's oil, whether it is gas, it will be financed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robert Kasande. We actually do have something that is quite associated with that. And it was a question for the panel that what other initiatives are being developed in Mozambique towards a low carbon future, for example, renewables. That's the legislative measures and ad hoc initiatives. But I believe this will be best addressed in the second session, unless Mr. Robert Kasande, since you talked about
That's
Mozambique. Fine. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, with about 12 minutes, we'll introduce the second session, and allow me to introduce to you my co-moderator, Mr. Zach Karaisa, who's going to take us on going forward. Thank you very much. Once again, I want to thank Professor Damilola, Professor Stephen Dow, Mr. Robert Kasande, Dr. Kobusheshe, Ms. Kate. Thank you very much for those insightful remarks, and we look forward to still having you in the next session and getting your expert advice going forward.